And after holding a research position here for several years, and he became a professor at University of Utah and has been there since then. And his research interests include numerically simulating cloud systems, and particularly emphasis on the interaction between large-scale, mesoscale, and cloud-scale processes, and as well between turbulence mixing and microphysics in cloud. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about it here today.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, let's see if this will work. Okay, has this come through? Okay. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about some of the research that I was involved with, supported and inspired by Akio Arakawa. When I came to UCLA, it was 1975, and this report on the physical basis of climate and climate modeling had just come out, and a lot of the students in Arakawa's group read this report because it was really the basis of studying cloud systems. And this pretty much laid out the task that he had for himself and his students for the next decades. Computation of the time-dependent, large-scale distribution of clouds in terms of the basic dynamical quantities for the purpose of cloud prediction as an important climatic variable and for treating radiation processes in the atmosphere properly. This is a diagram which we use to motivate our work. I guess we just have that noise, okay. So, all right. So, this diagram always needs to be updated because the boundaries of the domain size of the GCM stays constant, but the lower boundary keeps shrinking. But below that scale, we have our process models, cloud system resolving models, and large eddy simulation models. When I was starting out, the large eddy simulation models were really, really expensive. Jim Deerdorf had just done some of his first boundary layer simulations and first ones of he hadn't even done the one of the stratocumulus boundary layer yet. So cloud system resolving models were our tool. And it ended up that two-dimensional cloud system resolving models were what we could afford. The motivation for these was not to look at processes of individual clouds, but how clouds affected the processes, temperature, humidity, precipitation in a GCM grid box, such as this one right here. This is actually a diagram for the multi-scale modeling framework, but it actually is exactly what we were doing, just one box at a time. We would have a cloud resolving model that was a sample of this GCM grid box, and we would look at how the given large-scale conditions would control the distribution of clouds, and then how those clouds would feed back to the large scale. Later, this came to be called single column modeling. Recognize this? And in that case, we actually had a strong tie-in to observations, where observations, just like the ones through the Marshall Islands, which would basically be close to this region, were used to provide the advective tendencies, just like you might have advective tendencies from neighboring GCM columns. And these would be used to provide the so-called forcing for the cloud resolving models. And then we could actually compare the results to observations. Now that sort of work actually came a bit later than the period that I'm going to be talking about today, but this did lead to a strong tie-in with observations. And a lot of this was motivated and promoted by Dave. Okay, so here's our famous diagram. We are going to be talking about cumulus cloud ensembles today, and so again, this is supposed to represent a large scale area here. With the group of clouds, we have enough clouds to give a good statistics. And later we'll talk about what happens when the grid size gets smaller, so that perhaps only one cloud is within it. Okay, so the first work that we're aware of, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, for looking at the interaction between cumulus convection and larger scale motion was by Yamasaki in 1975. You can see the model here is a few tens of kilometers. It's two-dimensional, but it was run for many hours. And this is a Hofmiller diagram here. So looking at the precipitation as a function of the x-coordinate and time. So you can see many generations of clouds. And this is just exactly what we are after, to get the whole life cycle of many clouds. Sung and Tao were pioneers in this as well in the US. Tao went on to a long career with Joanne Simpson at Goddard, involved with using cloud resolving models, especially with the TRIM program. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think Wayne, I think maybe this was an offline discussion, but talking about what could be measured from radiosonde arrays. Professor Yanai, who was part of the department at UCLA, same time Akio was there, was very involved in calculating. This is the convective heat source, and so from good radiosonde arrays, you could actually get all three terms here. And so this is what you would measure, but in the budget equation, this is what it represented. These are cloud scale processes: turbulent vertical fluxes, condensation, evaporation, and radiation. And the same for the moisture budget here. So the totals could be measured, but to break them down into the actual processes was something that a model was useful for, even a conceptual model like the cumulus mass flux type approach. And that's what Yanai actually did, is he took these and, in a sense, deduced mass flux, but the cumulus ensemble models could actually calculate it. This is just an example of some of the data. This is from the GATE program. Here's what these early models look like. I'm not going to spend really any time, but just to show you the type of domain that we had. We could predict cloud droplets, raindrops. Not much in terms of radiation was normally prescribed, and the microphysics was relatively simple. Okay, so before I actually got my start, Chin Ho worked with Arakawa, and they built one of the first turbulence closure models in an attempt to look at the breakup of the stratocumulus clouds as they advect towards Hawaii. And they ended up using a 10-kilometer grid size and did get a breakup, but the important thing is that she incorporated a second moment turbulence closure model. And so this is just an introduction to what this sort of model can produce. This is a one-dimensional application of it to a stratocumulus cloud layer. Here's the liquid water profile, the radiation heating profile, the various turbulence fluxes, and variances and fluxes and so on. So when I came in, this work was ongoing, and so we already had a history of using higher order closure models. Another important work that influenced me was the early paper by Klemp and Williamson, three-dimensional convective storm dynamics. Now they were looking at supercells, but I was impressed by the attention they paid to the turbulence. You'd think Well, anyway, they compared what happens when you just use a so-called Smagorinsky closure. Actually, I have the closures here. Smagorinsky closure is just based on the velocity field gradients. A full turbulence kinetic energy equation is what Klemp and Wilhelmsen used. And this just looked more realistic to me. It includes buoyancy effects, and it has just more physics in it. So we knew that we really wanted to, even for clouds, deep clouds, we wanted to have a good turbulence parameterization, not just for the boundary layer. So what I ended up constructing over many years, and I'll go through some of the some of the development here. We decided that, well, let me just show you an example. This is the type of initial simulation that we did. Just 30 kilometers, 1 kilometer grid size, and this is a bubble of deep convection being traced by the moist static energy. So here's the updraft, a downdraft, a downdraft. This is just an interesting illustration. What I want to show you is the components. So just like Dave was talking about yesterday, model development, we have to pick the equations. So Lipson-Hemler had just come out with a nice scale analysis of the inelastic equation, so we followed them. We used it in a vorticity stream function form and with the Arakawa Jacobian. The scalar advection scheme, Arakawa also devoted a student to working on a scheme which was suited for cloud resolving models. This scheme was formally second order in space, but approximated to a third by having a sufficient amount of diffusion, so it kind of had a nice balance. And that was our advection scheme. This was in the days before we had all these, monotonic schemes and so on. Turbulence closure, I'll go into more detail, but this is just the reference. Surface fluxes, pretty standard. We built off of what Deardorff did. Moni-Nobukov similarity theory. Microphysics was always evolving. I first put in just something quite simple, warm rain type processes. Later we adopted what Steve Lord, also a student of Arakawa's, had put into a hurricane model. 3 water phase, 3 ice species. Even later, after some time with Quanman, they adapted the Morrison Gettleman, or the Morrison 2005. And then radiative transfer. This didn't happen until I moved to the University of Utah. And it was actually one of the drawing attractive aspects. Quonan Liao, who was here for many years at UCLA, was at Utah when I arrived. His student, Chong Fu, had been building a radiation code specifically for cloud models, and we put it in, and that pretty much completed our model. So we had interactive radiation, reasonably good microphysics, and so on. So now I'm going to talk a little about, well, maybe a lot about the turbulence closure. Okay. So this is out of the appendix of my dissertation, and this was actually based on a diagram that Chin Ho often used to explain the different closure approaches. So a typical turbulence closure will take these second moments, relate them diagnostically to a first moment, which are predicted by the model. A down gradient approach, for example. A second order or second moment closure model takes third moments, diagnostically relates them to second moments, which have their own prognostic equations. And you get the idea. Third moment then takes the fourth moments, relates them to third moments or second moments. And so this is what we did. And we ended up having prognostic equations for 24 second moments and, no, 11 second moments and 24 third moments, 35 in total. And this is because it was 2D. I'll show you here. We had, for example, we would have fluxes of temperature, both horizontal fluxes and vertical fluxes, and so on. And so here's the list of all these variables. Let me go through the development now. So we chose our turbulence closure equations to use. We basically didn't do any development with this. This had been recently published by Andre and others. This we had to do. The third moment closure that had been published were just in one dimension, but we wanted to put them on a two-dimensional grid. So Akio and I discussed what arrangement would be optimum, and we came up with our particular choice. As often is the case, it's a compromise. Then, finite difference forms of the continuous equations. Takes a while for 35 equations. And these included, because my advisor was Akio, we had to obey, I agreed, but we had to obey the integral constraints, so we didn't falsely produce variance or energy by having different forms in the different equations, so these were consistent in the finite difference equations. And wrote the Fortran code, and of course, you know it's an iterative process. The main problem we ended up with was, these equations are very finicky. They like to have wave solutions as well as sort of diffusive solutions. Luckily, Jim Deerdorf had written a paper on that, so he had given us some clues of how to fix this. Turns out that much more recently, Chin Ho, through analysis of a giga LES, basically a high-resolution LES, high-resolution model of deep convection, had shown that to get correct vertical fluxes, this is the vertical flux of a scalar C, you needed to look at the horizontal gradients. And typically, in a lot of boundary layer models, you don't look at the horizontal gradients, but you need to. And this is actually I'm putting this in just because this is actually further motivation for the fact that we did a fully two-dimensional turbulence closure. And I'm going to show you some results later that might be good because of this. I'm not sure yet, but anyway. This suggests that the fully 2D turbulence closure is beneficial when updrafts are at least partly resolved. Okay, so I may not be able to cover all of these, but that's okay. I'm going to go through some of the applications of these. I'll just mention who is involved now in case I don't get to them. I will get to these, of course. Quan Manchu and Dave Randall were involved in this application. Quan Man and Akio were involved in this one. Chi Chung Lin and Arakawa were involved in this one, cloud model for cumulus parameterization. Martin Kohler in this one, myself in this one, and myself in the last one. Okay, this is our first real application of the model, and I put this diagram in just because someone had mentioned, I think Dave, you mentioned the line printer. So here's my line printer output of a cloud system with different symbols for different hydrometeor combinations. What we did in this first study is we did a number of numerical experiments with these are cloud fraction over 5 days, over 512 kilometers. This is with shear, and without shear. And so you can see the sheared, we have convective systems that are translating, and here it's more scattered. So I'm not going to go through the details, but we were able to look at how good a relative humidity-based scheme is. This is what models or GCMs were using then as relative humidity to predict cloud fraction. There weren't prognostic hydrometeors. Low clouds, middle clouds, high clouds. And so you can see that the predictability given by relative humidity varied. The best was at mid-levels. We also divided into stratiform and convective type of clouds. The details here aren't important, but the main thing is that these were the first attempt to quantitatively examine these empirical assumptions that were used. And there are some conclusions here. It turns out relative humidity is, at that time, was best for diagnosing it. Well, turns out we didn't look at some variables that were actually better, which Dave and Kwanman looked at a few years later. So this was an advance. This is based on a longer set of simulations with observed large-scale forcing from GATE and also from a stratocumulus simulation. And this formula was developed from the cloud system resolving model results, and this is the most cited paper from our work, over 300 citations on this one. The previous cloud fraction one had over 200. So cloud fraction was a very important deal in the 1990s. So this is the actual simulated, and this is the what comes out of the formula. So I mean, you should get, so it shows a pretty nice match there. Okay, then closure assumptions used in the cumulus parameterization. One of the issues was how good is quasi-equilibrium, and what we did is we did simulations again with shear and without. With shear, you develop mesoscale convective systems, and we looked at how well the large-scale forcing, which is represented by this smooth curve, aligns with what actually happened in the simulation. This is the vertical kinetic energy. This is the horizontal mesoscale kinetic energy. You can see that in the case with no shear, there's a quite good correlation between the forcing and what happens. So this would be quasi-equilibrium. There's very little mesoscale. So it's all on the short time scale, the fast time scale of the updrafts. However, with shear, we get organized systems, and they have the wind and the kinetic energy are, a good part of it is in the mesoscale, and the mesoscale component can persist for quite some time. So you can see that these, of course, as we know, are not so well constrained by the large-scale forcing. Okay, then I think this one is one that especially interested me when I was looking through the papers. This diagram you've seen already, but this is showing moist static energy and height, and these are the trajectories of, I'm going to say, parcels or plumes with certain fractional entrainment rates. And in Arakawa Schubert, these fractional entrainment rates were taken to be constants, and you ended up with these various cloud types. This line here represents the height where these become non-buoyant. So a rapidly entraining cloud would reach this high. One without entrainment would reach up to here. So Chi Chung used the 2D model, and these are just some examples of his results. And we noticed that though the general form was similar to this, the details were different, especially at low levels. And this is something that Dave Nealon mentioned earlier this morning about the large or rapid entrainment and pretty much of all cloud types. even ones going up to relatively little entrainment later on, still entrained a lot at low levels. And this was a general characteristic. And I always wondered, how this is from a 2D model, how good is this? So just recently, we calculated the same sort of trajectories from a 3D LAS of deep convection. Now the cases are not, this case is not exactly set up the same as this, but it does show the same behavior of all these trajectories having a lot of entrainment at low levels and then sort of branching out from there. So I'm kind of interested. I mean, I'm hoping this is because of the third moment turbulence closure that led to this, but I don't know for sure. Okay, so how much time do I have? A couple more minutes? Okay, yeah, these last parts I go through pretty quickly. So, just wanted to mention Martin Kohler looked at explicit prediction of ice clouds, and the main point I wanted to show you here was just to reiterate how they would do numerical experiments. So they did several runs with just different aspects of the environment changed. Oops, wrong way, sorry. Come on. My hand doesn't obey. Okay, so control experiment and then a number of variations. And they were able to gather some useful information on how to improve the prediction of ice clouds in GCMs. The question of how stratocumulus clouds break up as they go towards the deep tropics was a question that has interested many of us in the group for many years, and we decided to apply the cloud system resolving model to that, and we found that the breakup happens when you develop decoupling, and Chris Brotherton did a lot of work on this later. And so you eventually get a layer of cumulus clouds underneath a layer of stratocumulus, and then the stratocumulus eventually dissipate. This simulation, one of the benefits of having this very generalized closure model is that we ran this simulation with no changes from any of the other simulations. We just changed the boundary conditions, and that was it. And we got this result. And this is run 1, this is run 2. So, and we did compared observations. So here's the cloud top compared to observations in the cloud base. Pretty good comparisons. Something that I was thinking about and got Akio and Chenming Wu here thinking later on is what happens when you start to reduce the grid size and the convective circulations start to fill up the column. So my initial analysis was simply to look at the convective fraction as a function of grid cell. So if a grid cell had convection in it, how much of the cell was filled with convection? And it obviously, on average, increases. Shall be done just after this slide. So the insight by Akio and Chenming was that the important parameter is the fractional coverage. It's not the grid size. The grid size, these grid sizes can have fractional coverages from 1 to very small. And so a unified parameterization came out as a result of this. Okay, so my last slide, 2D cloud system resolving models have provided many insights into the behavior of cloud systems relevant to large-scale cloud and boundary layer parameterization GCMs, well justifying Arakawa's support and use. Now I mentioned this is the era My talk is about the era, but it is not over because they endure in super parameterizations. And I think there's still a lot of room for working on these models. They're different than the ones that I use because the grid size is larger, and so they still require a very good turbulence closure. Okay, thank you.
Maybe we just take one quick question.
Does anybody else use third orbit closure?
The person who's been closest to this would be Jean-Luc Reidelsberger. They had a 3D cloud resolving model. It wasn't third order closure though, but they did have three-dimensional. No one else has been brave enough.